welcome to our podcast. It comes to us courtesy of the Touro College Jacob D. Fuchsberg Law Center and the Touro Law Review. Our guest today is Professor Walter E. Block, and our topic is decriminalization in the sex industry. So Professor Block is a PhD, which he got from Columbia University. He is the Harold E. Wirth Eminent Scholar Endowed Chair and Professor of Economics at Loyola University in New Orleans, and has just written, dozens of books and hundreds of journal articles, thousands of essays. I congratulate you on all of that. Being an effective and important and prolific scholar. So thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So because our audience is primarily a student audience, we like to begin by asking our guest about your career path. How did you come to be where you are today, such a noted scholar?
Well, I started off at James Madison High School, where I was buddies with Bernie Sanders. He and I were on overlapped for 4 years at Madison High School and 1 year at Brooklyn College, and I had roughly the same views as he had, namely socialism. And he was really avid about it. I was more interested in sports and girls in those days, but I was a socialist. And then I went to Brooklyn College, and Ayn Rand came to lecture at Brooklyn College, and I came to boo and hiss her because everyone knew that capitalism was evil. And after her lecture, they announced that the Ayn Rand Studies Club that had invited her was having a lunch in her honor, and anyone could come, even if you disagreed. And I wanted to convert her to socialism, so I approached her. And I said, there's a socialist here who wants to debate someone on socialism and capitalism. And they said, who is it? I said, me. And Nathaniel Brandon, her chief lieutenant, took me aside and said, look, we can't sit here at this table. There's no room, but let's go to the other end of the table and I'll talk to you under two conditions. One, you don't let this discussion end until we settle it. And two, you read two books that I'll recommend, Atlas Shrugged and Economics and One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. To make a long story short, I was converted to libertarianism then. And then I went off and got my PhD at Columbia. I was a philosophy major, and I was unsure whether philosophy or economics would be the best vehicle to promote liberty. And I finally decided it was economics, and I went off to Columbia. And then I've taught at several universities, but I've been at Loyola University, New Orleans since 2001. So I've been here for about 20 years. And I must mention that this article that I'm having published in Touro is not a solo authorship. My student, Fei Lin, is my co-author. And the paper started with a term paper that she wrote for one of my courses. So I want to give her credit also.
Well, thank you for that. And yes, when students and others are able to read the article, we'll see your co-author, who you actually put first. She's one asterisk, you're two asterisks. So thank you for bringing her work to our attention as well. I'm not sure you're the only one who failed to convert Ayn Rand to socialism, so we won't count that against you. I do find it interesting, though. It seems to me that regardless of the philosophy that guided you, were always interested in promoting liberty.
Yes, absolutely, in different ways. When I was a socialist, I thought that was the way to go. And then later I decided that was not the way to go.
Okay. And so, as you mentioned, you've written many articles, and one of your recent ones with your co-author is going to be about decriminalizing the sex work industry. So let me give you the floor. You can sort of state your thesis or your primary argument, and then I would ask you to discuss the philosophical underpinnings that begin your article.
Okay, well, first let me just say that there's a difference between a vice and a crime. And just because you favor the legalization of something doesn't mean you favor the thing itself. For example, say heroin. I think that except morphine for medical purposes, I think if you take heroin, that's a vice. Should it be a crime? Not according to libertarianism, not between consenting adults, because you own your body. Men own their bodies, women own their bodies. Feminists are very avid about this when it comes to abortion and other issues like that. And we should have a right to do with our bodies whatever we want, provided only that we do not violate the rights of other people. So my fist swinging ends where your nose starts. I can't impact your nose unless you've agreed to be in a boxing match with me, and then we can hit each other above the belt. But apart from that, I wouldn't want the wrong impression to be gotten that just because Phelan, Carol, and I favor the legalization of prostitution, it doesn't mean we favor prostitution. I personally have a wife, have a daughter, have a sister. I wouldn't want them to be prostitutes. I don't think that's a good way of operating. I think there are much better ways for people to operate. But if they were, God forbid, prostitutes, I wouldn't want them to go to jail for it. So you have to make a sharp distinction between favoring the thing itself and favoring the legalization of something. And Phelan, Carol, and I favor the legalization of prostitution, but not necessarily prostitution itself. And I certainly do not. Now, there's an interesting issue, philosophical issue about you do something and no money changes hands, and that's okay, that's kosher. On the other hand, you do something, the very exact same thing, and money changes hands, and all of a sudden, that's no good. Let me take an analogy from an area far removed from prostitution. Let's suppose you are very kind and you have 2 kidneys and I have no kidneys that are functioning. And Peter, you give me one of your kidneys. Well, that's okay. That's a mitzvah. That's a good deed. And no one would criticize you for it. We would all applaud you for it. I would certainly applaud you for it. However, suppose you charge me $30,000 for it. All of a sudden, oh, this is very bad. You shouldn't be, but it's the same thing. You're doing the same exact thing in both scenarios, only one you're doing it for free, and the other you're doing it for a fee. Financial money is changing hands, and all of a sudden, something that is legitimate becomes illegitimate just because money changes hands. I find that preposterous. Now let's get back to prostitution. 2 people go to bed with each other. Nobody complains. It's certainly not illegal. And now 2 people go to bed with each other and one pays the other, and all of a sudden that becomes illicit. This is a problem that certainly free enterprises such as I would have a problem with, because what is per se wrong with money changing hands? Now, we're not talking about I come up with a gun and I say, give me your money or I'll shoot you, and money changes hands that way. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a voluntary payment, either for the kidney transplant or for prostitution. And in my view, it shouldn't matter whether money changes hands or not. The substantive issue is the thing. And the substantive issue in both cases are a voluntary interaction, whether it's the kidney or the sexual services or what have you. So I find it appalling and highly problematic that something gets to be prohibited by law just because money changes hands, when you do the exact same thing and no money changes hands, and that's okay.
All right. So Professor Block, that you certainly make that point in your article and really you expand on it in terms of perhaps a libertarian philosophy, but you also bring in some feminist perspective. And I know there are different schools of thought with respect to feminism, and you feel that at least one of them is consistent with your view that decriminalization will ultimately lead to among other things, a safer environment for what we're talking about. So could you talk about, because you mentioned, it could sound incongruous, how you could incorporate certain feminist philosophy and reconcile it with your libertarian view?
Well, it's sort of like a Venn diagram, 2 circles overlapping. feminism and libertarianism, and I think at least some strands of feminism overlap with libertarianism on this ground. I think I'm no expert on feminist philosophy, but I think there's a division, or there's a debate among feminists as to whether prostitution should be legal or not. Now, obviously, libertarianism is not consistent with those feminists who think it should be prohibited by law, but there are other feminists who are have just as good credentials as feminists who think that it should be legal, and we would overlap with them. And I don't see why that would be a problem, because, as I say, the feminists are disputing that amongst themselves. Look, we libertarians also have disputes. Murray Rothbard is pro-choice. Ron Paul is pro-life. And so libertarians are very divided on abortion, divided on immigration, divided on a whole bunch of other issues. So I'm not criticizing feminism just because they're not 100% all in agreement on everything. The human condition is such that, this isn't rocket science. This is more complicated than rocket science in some ways, philosophy. So people who are very bright and with the best of intentions of feminists, some come out on one side, some come out on the other side. And we libertarians would come out on the side of the feminists who favor legalization, not favor prostitution, but favor the legalization of prostitution. Okay. Now, you mentioned, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, please continue. Please finish your thought.
The other point you mentioned was, well, wouldn't it be safer if it was legalized? And the answer is certainly yes. If it's prohibited and a prostitute has a bad experience with a client, she can't go to the cops because they'll arrest her. So she'll be more victimized, and maybe she'll be victimized by a pimp. Whereas in most of Europe, especially in the northern European countries, and also in Las Vegas, in Nevada, apart from Las Vegas, prostitution is legal. And there are houses of, I won't call it ill repute, but houses of prostitution. And it's very safe. The providers of the service, both male and female, but mainly female, are checked every once in a while or regularly for health. And there's no beating up of prostitutes any more than there'd be beating up of waitresses or doctors or lawyers or anything else like that. So I think that if prostitution were legal, not only would the Johns be safer, but also the prostitutes. So maybe I should put it the other way around. Not only would the prostitutes be safer, but so would the Johns.
All right. Well, let's if you don't mind, let's expand a little bit on the various systems that we had. I mean, I know you're an economist and you talk about an economic model. Let's just actually put that aside just for a moment, because you've mentioned really legal systems. You talked about some of the European models. I know in your article, you talk about the Nordic model. Looks like you compare and contrast that with maybe New Zealand and this curious Rhode Island phenomena, but also Nevada outside of Las Vegas, as you just mentioned. And so, I mean, some of these, like in the large part of the US, it's still criminalized. And then there's sort of hybrid models where parts of the transaction are criminalized, other parts are not. And then there are perhaps the more systems that are completely decriminalized. So if you wouldn't mind maybe expanding a little bit on that and maybe comparing and contrasting these models and the phenomena that results.
Well, you're quite right. There is a continuum. At the extreme libertarian end would be total legalization. That would be it. At the other end, there would be total prohibition. And there are various countries that have various combinations and permutations of that, where certain aspects of it will be legal, and there'd be certain rules that you have to, I don't know, be in a certain kind of a place, say a zoning law. You can't have a house of prostitution next to a school or next to a church or something like that. So there'd be various models, various countries, and various, not only countries, but take the US with regard to drugs. There are some states that marijuana is fine for recreational purposes. There are some states it's not fine for recreational purposes, but it's okay for medicinal purposes. And then there are other states where it's not even okay for medicinal purposes. And every year it changes around a little bit. Hopefully the time will move us toward more and more legalization from a libertarian point of view. And it's the same thing with prostitution. Now, I don't know, every country and what the rule are in New Zealand or Denmark or Sweden. All I can say is that just as various countries have different combinations and permutations, so do different states. For example, in Oregon, they just legalized, what was it, cocaine and heroin, which I think Oregon is the only state that does that. And as you mentioned, Las Vegas, rather Nevada, apart from Las Vegas, I'm not sure why Las Vegas, the city, can't have prostitution, whereas the rest of the state can. But I think that's the only state where it's legal. But then again, you get dead letter laws. It might be prohibited in a certain state, but the police just look the other way. And it might be that a prostitute could come to the police and he wouldn't arrest her, even though he should. But because he's a decent guy and he realizes this is, what do they say? Robert Nozick, a famous philosopher, said capitalist acts between consenting adults. A lot of the lefties say, and I agree with them, anything between consenting adults. And what Nozick says is, well, how about capitalist acts between consenting adults? And so I think in one of my books, what I do is I say that the police are the good guys if they disobey bad laws. And there might be a law against prostitution and a policeman refuses to arrest the prostitute. And I think that would be virtuous on the part of the police, because we have a higher justice or a higher law than the extant law. We've established that with the Nuremberg trials. I mean, what the Nazis were saying is, hey, why are you on our case? We were just obeying the law. And the Nuremberg trial says, tut, 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 not so fast. I'm putting words into the Nuremberg trial, but they said that we think that there's a higher law. You're not supposed to do that to Jews and gypsies and gays and blacks, even though the German law said you could. So I would say that if there was a state where prostitution was very much against the law, a policeman who didn't obey the law, paradoxically, would be better than a policeman who did obey the law.
All right. Now, of course, you certainly put it well in talking about the continuum and the hybrid. And yes, I mean, I guess you could spend years studying every state, every county, and every country. But obviously you have a good grasp of the continuum. And decriminalization, you believe, will address a number of real negatives. And you've indicated one, which is that a sex worker could at least go to the police without fear of arrest themselves. And currently that's only done ad hoc and, informally and frankly, unlawfully. So if you could, what other negatives do you believe that decriminalization would start to solve?
Well, what are the negatives with decriminalization start to solve?
Like stigma, or what other?
Well, I'm not really that concerned about the stigma. I mean, the stigma is sort of a libertarian, and that is not a question for libertarians. If people want to stigmatize prostitutes, as a libertarian, I can say, well, I'm not doing that, but I don't see why that should be against the law. And I don't even see why that's bad. I mean, I think, we all have subjective tastes. And, if you want to stigmatize people who are too fat, I don't personally want to do that. I think that would be very bad. But if people wanted to do it, I wouldn't say, well, that should be against the law. Although there are some people now who say that that should be against the law. So one of the problems is that prostitution is stigmatized by the overall population, although there are certain subsegments of the population where the very opposite would be the case. So I'm not so concerned about stigma, but you're saying, what are the other benefits of legalizing it beside making it safer for prostitutes? I would say one of the benefits is justice. It's unjust to put people in jail for consenting adult behavior. Now, I'm not talking about you go to bed with a 5-year-old girl. We're not talking about that. And I don't know what the age of consent is. It's somewhere around 18 or 21. I don't know. But whatever the age of consent is, if you go to bed with a person above that age of consent, I think it would be unjust to punish you for it. So another gain from legalization is not so much pragmatism or utilitarian, but more deontology, more justice and rights. We would be getting closer to a just society if we didn't put people in jail for doing consensual adult behavior.
So, I mean, obviously, justice and safety are are some of the most significant goals in any society. You're an economist, and you're certainly used to studies and data, et cetera. And so, if we could turn to that for a moment, one thing that struck me in the article was, to the extent that there is some data or there are some studies, it seems that they seem to suggest that decriminalization could lead to a safer life for a sex worker. And one of the fears that somehow decriminalization would attract more sex workers, the studies didn't bear that out. I mean, am I understanding your writing on these points?
Well, there was this guy Card who just won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he and Kruger had this very famous study of minimum wage law. New Jersey raised it minimum wage, and nearby contiguous Pennsylvania didn't, and they failed to find more unemployment for New Jersey. Well, as an economist, I believe minimum wage laws create unemployment. And just because they failed to find it doesn't mean that it wasn't there, or that there weren't other variables in New Jersey and Pennsylvania that they didn't control for. Well, it's the same thing here. I believe that supply curves slope upward and demand curves slope downward. And if you legalize something, you're going to get more of it than if you prohibit it, because if you prohibit it, people have to pay a price for it, and the more that you have to pay, the less you're going to buy. I mean, if you're wearing a nice jacket, and if the jacket costs 10,000, you would buy fewer of those jackets than if it costs 150 or whatever. Namely, the higher the price, the less we'll do, and prohibiting it by law is raising the price against it. So if we if we legalize it, thus lower the price down to zero, there'd be no penalty. Well, I would expect we'd have more. And just because some studies didn't show that we would have more, well, that just shows that we didn't dig deeply enough, because basic premise of economics is supply curve slope upward and demand curve slope downward. And anytime you don't find that, I would be suspicious of your empirical work, and I am suspicious of that empirical work. We're reporting. We didn't conduct the.
No, of course. But would that then be an argument against decriminalization if decriminalizing increases the vice?
Well, you could say that. Yes, that would be an argument against. One could say that if you want to wipe it out, the thing to do is to not decriminalize, but make the death penalty. Let's have the death penalty for prostitution, and and we'll have a lot less of it. But is that just? Is that fair? Is that proper? And will more people die from the lack of safety? So. You're quite right. One could launch that argument, and I think you wouldn't be zigging where you should be zagging. Namely, if you legalize, you're going to have more of it. And do we really want more of it? Well, as a libertarian, I am indifferent. Look, do we want? I mean, what we want is the optimal amount. We want the optimal amount of peas and carrots. And let's suppose that peas and carrots are 50% each. That would be the optimal amount. Or let's suppose that the optimal amount is 50 and 50, and somehow there's 75% peas and 25% carrots. Should the government get involved in getting us toward the right amount? No, I think the market will get us there. If there's too many peas, the price of peas will come down. Profits will go out of peas and into carrots. So I would say this is the same thing. There's the optimal amount of prostitution from a libertarian point of view. I don't know what it is, but I think what it is when it's legal. That's the optimal amount. And now we have too little prostitution because it's prohibited and it's stopping some people from doing prostitution, whether on the buying or the selling side. So I think that you're making a decent point and a very clever point and a very important point. But my reaction to that would be, well, maybe we don't have enough prostitution. Maybe we should have a little more. And we would have more, I think, despite the statistics, if we legalized it.
Now, just for our listeners, so they don't give their moderator too much credit here, the point does in fact come from Professor Block article, which to his credit and to his co-author's credit, they don't shy away from discussing opposing points of view and trying to put it into a perspective or otherwise making sure the discussion is as thorough as possible.
Wait a second. While we're giving credit, not only should we give credit to me and my co-author, we should give credit to the Turo editorial board or the editors of Turo, because when we gave them the paper, I won't say it was a piece of crap. It was a good paper, but they made it better.
Oh, good.
They were very thorough. They edited the thing. They posed all sorts of questions and problems that we had to overcome to get it accepted. So while we're throwing out bouquets, I think some of the bouquets go to the Turo law review people.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm sure they'll be gracious in catching the bouquet. The one other point that I found really very interesting when you talked about whether it's exploitation, if one makes an economic choice, whether it's the garbage economy where someone, because they have few choices, decides, okay, it's okay to dump that toxin here, pay me, but I'll take the risk. And you do talk about the nature of decisions by people who don't have that many alternatives economically, and whether or not that is exploitive or oppressive. I found that very interesting. If you could just speak about that for time.
Yeah, another argument against prostitution is that it preys on the poor. That the poor don't have that many options, and they're impoverished, and therefore that's why they get into prostitution. Whereas if you come from middle class or a wealthy family, you have many more options and you're less likely to get into it. Well, it seems to me that if there's any exploitation, it's why are they poor in the first place? Maybe they've been exploited into poverty, and I don't know. I'm just that's a different issue. In other words, here you see a poor woman, and I say woman because most prostitutes are women, not men, although there are some male prostitutes. So here is a poor woman, and she's got many options. Well, not many options, she's got a few options. And one of them, the one that she thinks is the best one for her, is prostitution. And what we do is we take that one away from her, and we don't improve her situation. We're considering her an adult and a responsible person. It's very similar to the sweatshops in Bangladesh or other places. People try to boycott sweatshop products because it's come from the poor. Well, if you do that, Kathy Lee Gifford was in trouble because she set up a sweatshop in Bangladesh, and she offered, 10 cents an hour. And this was seen as appalling, and we have to boycott this. Well, how much were the people making before she got there? 5 cents an hour. Otherwise, she wouldn't have got any employees if she didn't offer them more. So she was improving their situation. And if you boycott that so that we can't import sweatshirts from sweatshops, well, then you were worsening their situation. Then they go on to garbage places and try to eke out a living that way. Well, it's the same thing with prostitution. A poor woman, yes, she has truncated choices. And now you're going to take one of them away from her? And you think you're making her better off? Well, you better study logic a little bit more. I mean, Bernie Sanders says, my old buddy says, there are too many, too many underarm deodorants or too many, what do you call it, breakfast cereals, and, we should get rid of some. Well, what's the optimal number of them? I think the optimal number of them is whatever the market comes up with. And Bernie, the central planner, is going to, have only 3 underarm deodorants or 5 breakfast cereals instead of 50 of each. Well, he's not helping people. And it's the same thing if you tell a woman, you now have 5 choices. Oh, wait, now you only have 4 because, you can't be a prostitute.
Okay. I guess this question is a little bit more personal, but it does sound to me like your prior life as a socialist has allowed you to hone your present life as a libertarian. I mean, having had a foot in the other camp, perhaps is, I don't know, honed your perspective as a libertarian.
No, I think that's true. That, I'm a big fan of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And he says, if I could put words in his mouth, that if you don't know the other side, you don't even know your own side. Because your own side is really defined in tandem or in contrast with the other side. So I think I am helped because I know the other side a little bit better than if I never contemplated or never held those views. And I think that I can more powerfully defend the libertarian side because I know better what the other side is. Whereas if you're monomaniacal or you only had one type of view your whole life, well, you could read the other side, but it's not the same as actually believing it. And for a while, I did believe in that stuff.
Well, that's certainly important perspective for any advocate. I mean, first you're a scholar, so you basically do neutral research, but then you want to defend it. And certainly knowing the other side is probably a must to ultimately be effective. Our time has flown by. And so that's always nice, but I do want to give you an opportunity to make any final points you'd like to make, or any summary, or just really any last word that you'd like to share with us.
Well, Phelan Carroll was my co-author. This paper started as a term paper that she wrote for me for one of my classes, and I give her great credit for this paper. And if ever you want to have someone else on your program on this subject, I recommend her. And I'm also very grateful to your Turo Law Review people who helped us make this a better paper. And I'm just delighted that Turo will be publishing this paper within a couple of weeks or a month or 2 or whenever.
All right. Well, I look forward to publication, though, again, I've had the sneak peek. I've been able to read it. Professor Block, thank you so much for joining us. I've been your moderator, Professor Peter Zablotsky, here at Turo Law School. And thank you for listening. And once again, a final thank you to the review for making all this possible, and to Professor Block for being our guest.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.